Hi, good morning. My name is Alex Padilla. I'm the director of the Exploring Economic Freedom project, and today I'm very happy to host our first guest speaker for the semester. His name is Dr. William Luther. He's an assistant professor in economics at Kenyon College. He's originally from Ohio. He went to Capital University and he got his PhD in economics from George Mason University in 2012. He's been a fellow with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and the American Institute of Economic Research. Professor Luther is primarily interested in question of currency acceptance and the role of government plays in determining commonly accepted medium of exchange. He has written extensively on the monetary regime of Somalia following the state collapse in 1991, and he's also written about Bitcoin. And today, Professor Luther is going to talk to us about Bitcoin. Please welcome William Luther. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Alex. So May 4th, 2011 didn't seem to be a particularly significant day for me at the time. I was a graduate student in the Department of Economics at George Mason University, and my colleague, Chuck Moulton, was scheduled to present a paper at our weekly monetary economics workshop. So after breakfast, I poured myself a second cup of coffee and settled in to read Chuck's draft. You can see Chuck's words here. In the physical world, we trust money is genuine because it's familiar. Copying it is technologically hard, and laws prohibit counterfeiting. Dollars have a look and feel we have come to expect. They're rectangular of consistent dimensions, have a green tint to them, and are printed on a paper cloth mixture. Security devices like watermarks, special inks, and micro printing prevent simply running off a bunch of copies at Kinko's. Each bill has a unique serial number. Stiff penalties and counterfeiting laws have deterrent effects on potential criminals, and Secret Service agents proactively investigate possible violations. That's all well and good, Chuck had written, in the physical world. But suppose you wanted to implement an online currency. Chuck's paper would be my introduction to Bitcoin, and that was the first big cryptocurrency to hit the market. Now, what you got to keep in mind is that few people were talking about Bitcoin in May of 2011. You could purchase one Bitcoin on the popular Mt. Gox exchange for about $3.40. And to my knowledge, the only people who were interested in Bitcoin at the time were anti-government types and techno-utopians. Now, Chuck, I believe he considered himself to be a mix of both of those two groups, and so he was very excited about Bitcoin. And he thought that as young monetary economists, we should be considering Bitcoin as well. But as we sat around the room discussing Chuck's paper and Bitcoin more broadly, I've got to tell you, it soon became clear that Chuck was on his own here. The rest of us weren't persuaded. In fact, I remember exactly what I said to Chuck. I said, Chuck, this is very interesting, but I don't think it's ever going to catch on. Now, despite his best efforts, Chuck had failed to convince a room full of monetary economists, folks who were going to devote the rest of their life to considering peculiar currencies. He failed to convince us that Bitcoin was going to be this next big thing. How then could we expect that Bitcoin proponents were going to have any more luck with the broader population? Boy, was I wrong. Right? Today, an article on Bitcoin appears in major newspapers almost every day, whereas you could purchase them for $3.40 in May of 2011. Today, this morning when I checked, Bitcoins were exchanging for about $650. And indeed, a whole cottage industry has emerged to help you make transactions with Bitcoin. Everything from Bitcoin ATMs to financial intermediaries. It's certainly a world that we couldn't have foreseen that day. Today, I want to address a big question, whether or not Bitcoin will survive. And in order to do that, we're going to have a solid understanding of what Bitcoin is and how it functions so we can address that big question. So we'll start off asking just what is Bitcoin? How do you get Bitcoin? How do you make transactions with Bitcoin? Then we'll move on to asking this big question, will Bitcoin survive? And that's going to lead us into some alternatives to Bitcoin as well, what we'll call altcoins or alternative cryptocurrencies. And finally, since it's such a current topic, I'll try and leave some time there at the end to talk about some recent events with Bitcoin. So from the top, what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is an unbacked digital currency which launched as an open source software in January of 2009. Now, by unbacked, I mean that the currency is not redeemable for some underlying commodity. So historically, banks would issue their own notes, banknotes, and these notes would actually be redeemable for some underlying commodity like silver or gold. And so if we were under, say, a gold standard and you went to the bank with $1, they would redeem that $1 for $1's worth of gold, or actually a fixed quantity of gold that they had agreed to hand over in advance. Today, our currency isn't backed. It's what we call a fiat currency. And so if you take in a $10 bill to your local bank, they'll happily exchange that for, say, 2 5s or 5 and 5 1s, or if their till is full, you might even convince them to give you 10 1s, but they're not going to redeem that for some underlying commodity like historical monies. So Bitcoin is an unbacked money. Now I should say that although it's an unbacked money, it's perhaps inappropriate to call Bitcoin a fiat money, because fiat is translated means by decree. And the reason we use the word fiat, or historically the way this came to be, was that monies that weren't backed were always, to my knowledge, monies that were created by decree, by governments. And of course, Bitcoin is not created by government. So it's an unbacked digital currency. Now I should say also that occasionally, so it's a digital currency, so all of the transactions are ultimately going to take place online. But occasionally, if you read a story about Bitcoin, you'll come across a picture that looks something like this, where there are actually physical coins. These physical coins are actually token coins. If you look closely at some of the coins in the background, you can see that on the reverse side there's actually a holographic image. And if you peel back that holographic image, you'll reveal a unique address to a balance of Bitcoin that is available online. Now here's the thing though, if you peel back that hologram, then everyone that you pass that coin on at a later date will know that you knew what that address was, and so it's possible that you've gone online and transferred that balance of Bitcoin. And so if you were to do that to these physical token coins, they probably wouldn't exchange as Bitcoin any longer. But occasionally you will see these physical token coins. You don't see a lot of them circulating really, because one of the major advantages of Bitcoin is that it's a digital currency. But they are out there, and reporters certainly love to show this photo. So these aren't really Bitcoin, they're token coins. Bitcoin is an unbacked digital currency, so it's all going to take place online. Okay, so how does Bitcoin work? So we're going to ask a couple questions to figure out how Bitcoin works. The first question is, how do you acquire Bitcoin, right? If you're going to use Bitcoin, if you're going to make transactions with Bitcoin, you would have to acquire it. And so we should see how that actually functions. There are a couple ways that you can acquire Bitcoin. The most common way is to just go to an online exchange and purchase some Bitcoin electronically. And so that's going to look a lot like a PayPal account. I can show you that, a screenshot of that in a moment. And so you can just exchange local currencies. So here would be dollars, or you could use yen or euro or whatever exchange you're on. You could exchange your local currency for Bitcoin and acquire Bitcoin that way. So that's certainly the most common way, is through these online exchanges. But there are a couple companies actually that recently opened up a Bitcoin ATM. And that's another way you could exchange local currency for Bitcoin. Now in the US, I've heard that there's a Bitcoin ATM in Austin, But usually the only time you see the Bitcoin ATMs in the US is when there's some kind of a cryptocurrency convention, because the legality of these ATMs is still under question. In Canada, I believe they do have some Bitcoin ATMs, and also elsewhere around the world. So you can exchange it for local currency. Here's a Bitcoin ATM, and the way this works is you would just put in your local currency, and that would then give you a quick response code or a QR code, maybe you've seen these around, that you could either then use to spend if someone was willing to accept your QR code, or more likely you would just add that balance, perhaps with your smartphone, to your online e-wallet. So you can exchange local currency for Bitcoin. That's one way to get them. Another way to get Bitcoin is just to accept Bitcoin in exchange. So if you're selling some good or service, you can offer to accept Bitcoin, and if someone has Bitcoin, they can hand that over to you. There's actually a third way to get Bitcoin. It's commonly called mining, though that's perhaps a misleading term. We'll talk a bit more about mining in a bit. But I'll say for the time being that it's very difficult to get Bitcoin via mining these days, because the costs of mining have gone up as lots of people have entered the mining game. So we'll return to this issue of mining in a bit. It is a way that you could get Bitcoin, but it's not very common for the general user today. So now that you know how to acquire Bitcoin, I'll show you a picture. This is from a website called Coinbase. It looks a lot like PayPal, and you can see here that you can buy Bitcoin by connecting your Coinbase account to, say, a bank account, and it's just like making any other online purchase. We'll return to this in a moment when we're talking about making transactions. So what can you do with Bitcoin? Well, or rather, how do you make transactions with Bitcoin? So we can think of two types of transactions. We can think of online transactions. Those are probably the most common at present. So with an online transaction, you'll go to a merchant who accepts Bitcoin. So perhaps it's a charity and you want to donate in Bitcoin. Or it might even be a booming internet company like Overstock.com that now accepts Bitcoin as payment. And so you would just go onto their site. So one of two ways. Either they have the access point on their site, so you would go and make your purchase at checkpoint instead of at the checkout, instead of clicking that you're going to pay with a credit card, or I guess they're probably not going to accept checks or cash, but instead of checking that you want to pay with a credit card, you would just say that you're going to transfer them Bitcoin, and you would make a payment much like you would with PayPal. And so the other way that you can make an online transaction, if you look up here in the top right of the screen, you'll see that it says send money or request money. And so you could, in fact, if any of you would like to experiment with Bitcoin and you would like to just send me lots of Bitcoin, feel free to do so. I'd be happy to provide you with my QR code. But you would just go to a merchant like Coinbase and click send money, and they'll ask you for the recipient. So with Coinbase, it's via email. And so it's a lot like sending or receiving money with PayPal. Okay, so making online transactions, that's not what most people are talking about with Bitcoin these days. Most people are actually talking about face-to-face transactions. So how do you make a face-to-face transaction? Well, we've said that it's a digital currency, and so these transactions are still going to take place online. It's just that the buyer and the seller are going to be in the same location. And so the way that that typically works is that when you get to your checkout, they will effectively request money from you, whatever your bill is, thereby generating a quick response code, which you would then scan probably with your smartphone. And that quick response code, it just tells the application how much money to send and who to send it to. And so when you scan that and click pay, the protocol will transfer Bitcoin to the seller. And so we also said that there are those token coins, so that would be another way you could make transactions, though not a lot of people are using those token coins, perhaps for obvious reasons. One of the big benefits here is that You're probably carrying your phone around anyway, and so you don't want to carry around a pocket full of coins. Okay, so far we've just covered kind of the simple aspects of Bitcoin. How do you get it? How do you make transactions? But actually, I think the most interesting aspect of Bitcoin is what's going on behind the scenes, how payments are processed. And before we say how payments are processed with Bitcoin, it's helpful to consider why we need to process payments. And so let's think about a simple transaction where I'm exchanging, say I'm giving you a balance of dollars. So you can see that I have this balance of dollars, it's in my hand, and you can feel when I transfer that balance of dollars to you, you know that you've received it. And importantly, for the monetary system more broadly, I am unable to spend that balance of dollars again. Why? Well, in the case of physical cash, because I no longer have it. I've given it to you. And so with physical currency, there's little risk of double spending because you actually have to turn over the cash, and so you don't have the cash to then spend again. That's a problem for digital currencies. Right? Think about the last email that you sent to a friend. Right? That email is now in their inbox, but it's in your sent folder too. Or think about digital music. You can transfer music to a colleague, and you have that music as well. And so it's a lot different when we're talking in the digital world than in the physical world. And that has been a big problem with digital currencies in the past, this double spending problem. When someone spends a balance of digital currency, how do we make sure that they don't then go ahead and spend that balance again? How do we make sure that when they transfer a balance of currency that they no longer have access to that currency? Now, I imagine most of you have bank accounts, and so you've probably made some electronic transfers with your bank account. So we can think about how a traditional bank processes these transactions. So if you were to say, write me a check, which I'm also accepting checks, so Bitcoin and checks. I've made 2 requests today. There'll be a sign-up sheet at the end. Don't worry about that. But if you were to write me a check, not only would I be grateful, but I would know that that you're not going to be able to spend this balance again because the bank is going to clear this transaction. So what does the bank do? Well, the bank debits your account and credits my account. So they reduce your balance, they take that away from you, and they add it to me. And since that's been taken away from you, since the bank has cleared this payment, we don't have to worry about you spending that balance again. And so through this centralized clearinghouse, we've solved the double spending problem. And in the US, we have a couple institutions that do this, Fedwire and the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, commonly known as CHIPS, process payments, say, between banks. And so that's been the standard model to solving this double spending problem, is to have a central clearinghouse. Bitcoin doesn't have a central clearinghouse. The way Bitcoin clears transactions is completely different. They have a decentralized clearing process. And so the way that this works, at the center of Bitcoin is a public ledger of all past transactions. It's called the blockchain. And so on this blockchain, it lists every Bitcoin that's in existence, that is in existence, and who possesses that Bitcoin. Now, they don't have your names. They just have some online address. But anytime you transfer Bitcoins, you're just updating this single ledger. So we can think about how this works in practice. So if you want to make a transaction, right? So suppose that I'm sending you Bitcoin, returning the favor perhaps. What I would do is announce effectively to the system that I have some balance of Bitcoin, and I would like to transfer that balance of Bitcoin to you. And then all of the other nodes on the system, all of the other users, it's a peer-to-peer system, all of the other users then compete to be the first person to process this transaction. And what that entails, right? So the transaction is actually bunched together with a lot of other transactions into a block, and the block is processed as a series of transactions. But what that entails is that all these nodes compete to solve a complicated cryptography problem. Now this problem has to be complicated. If it were easy to solve this cryptography problem, you could confirm your own transactions. Turns out that's not a very good system. Right? I could send you some Bitcoin in exchange for, say, some alpaca socks, and then before, and confirm that transaction. And at the same time, I could send you some Bitcoin, perhaps in exchange for pixie sticks, which happens to be my favorite candy. And if I'm confirming my own transactions, right, that's a lot like me saying, don't worry, I've paid you. Don't worry about it. The check's in the mail. And so that would be a problem if you could confirm your own transactions. And so the way the system works is it has this very difficult cryptography problem. And so that effectively reduces the probability reduces the likelihood that you confirm your own transaction to a random variable that's proportional to your computing power. And so as long as no one of us has access to a majority of the computing power on the system, then we don't have to worry that people are going to be confirming their own transactions. And so it's kind of an interesting way that we've solved this problem. So we have the blockchain. New transactions are grouped into a block, and about every 10 minutes, this block is hashed. In other words, someone solves this cryptography problem that says, yes, Professor Luther originally had this balance of Bitcoin, and he has transferred this balance of Bitcoin to Professor Kachanowski, and this is consistent with all past transactions, so Professor Luther hasn't spent this balance of Bitcoin in the past. And so although this aspect of Bitcoin, oftentimes when you hear this in the news, they're talking about Bitcoin as an alternative currency, as a medium of exchange. But actually, I think that this is perhaps the most interesting thing about Bitcoin, the way that it's processing transactions in this decentralized way. And we'll talk more about why that's interesting in a bit. Okay, so now we know how you can get some Bitcoin. We know that how you can make transactions with Bitcoin, and we now see how transactions are processed with Bitcoin. The big question then is, why would anyone accept Bitcoin? What's the point? Why don't we just keep using dollars? So I like to divide the reasons why people accept Bitcoin into two broad categories, what we might call non-monetary explanations and monetary explanations. And certainly in the early stages of Bitcoin, the non-monetary explanations were probably driving the demand for Bitcoin, whereas today, perhaps to a bigger extent, though I still think there's a big non-monetary component, to a bigger extent there's monetary concerns. So the non-monetary reasons why people would like to transact with Bitcoin or would like to accept Bitcoin are things like, earlier I mentioned that the only people talking about Bitcoin in the early stages were folks like techno-utopians. And so techno-utopians or futurists, they like being on the cutting edge. They like using the next big thing. They like technology, hanging out with their Silicon Valley pals. And when they're sipping their cappuccino, they like being able to say, hey, have you heard about this new thing called Bitcoin? Because I already have some. And so since they have this perhaps bizarre preference to be at the cutting edge, they're not even concerned so much with whether it takes off or whether it's the next big thing. They like being there on the ground floor. And so you might think that for these techno-utopians, these futurists, accepting Bitcoin, especially in the early stages, is a way that they could experience the future today. And so they were willing to accept Bitcoin. Another big group of folks who are accepting Bitcoin in the early stages, and for primarily, I would argue, non-monetary reasons, are what we might call anti-government types. Anarcho-capitalists, libertarians, anarchists more broadly. They like the idea that this currency isn't backed or even associated, though we'll put an asterisk on that, isn't associated with the government in any way. And so by accepting Bitcoin or using Bitcoin, they get this sense that perhaps they're undermining the government in some way. And so again, we have a case of perhaps peculiar preferences driving this early demand. And the last non-monetary factor I'll point to is speculation. So some folks are holding Bitcoin not because they're interested interested in it so much as a money, but because they've seen on the news that the value of Bitcoin has shot up. And so they're holding Bitcoin at the moment, expecting that they'll be able to sell that at a higher price in the future. So we might call this a speculative demand for Bitcoin. But what we're interested in, or at least what I'm interested in as a monetary economist, is the monetary demand for Bitcoin. Does Bitcoin have some advantages? It might also have some disadvantages, but does it have some advantages? Because if it doesn't have any advantages, we can just fold this up and go home, right? There's no reason to accept Bitcoin if there are no advantages. And so there are some advantages to using Bitcoin. For one, it's quasi-anonymous. I stress the phrase, the quasi aspect there. In the early stages of Bitcoin, a lot of folks were saying that it allowed you to make anonymous transactions. That's certainly not the case. You can ask Ross William Albrecht or Charlie Shrem about that. Both of them are currently facing charges for transactions that they made with Bitcoin. In the case of Ross William Albrecht, he's accused of being the Dread Pirate Roberts. A notorious character who started up a website called the Silk Road, not the one you read about in your 8th grade history class, but a website where you could purchase illicit goods like drugs. That's not a big problem here, right? In Colorado, you don't have to go to the Silk Road anymore, I guess. But for the rest of us, maybe I should have said for the rest of them, you have to go, you could go onto the Silk Road and purchase marijuana, and I think there was also some incidences of prostitution as well. And so this was a website where you could, and a hit, I should mention that one, because Ross William Albrecht is accused of actually making that particular transaction there, trying to hire a hit. So yeah, that's one place to use Bitcoin, but it's not anonymous, certainly, because, well, they figured out who this guy was. And William Shrem, he actually ran what at the time was the big financial intermediary with Bitcoin. So they were allowing you to make payments and accept payments in Bitcoin. The company was called BitInstant, and he spoke about a couple months ago at a conference, I believe in Atlanta, Georgia, at a cryptocurrency conference, and he was arrested in JFK on his way home. So I'm going to be a little more cautious as I go through security, having given this talk today, so thank you very much for putting me at risk. So they're both facing charges, and serious charges. Shrem could face up to 40 years in prison for running this, for acting as a financial intermediary for some transactions that were taking place on the Silk Road. So that's, they're definitely not anonymous. But quasi-anonymous. You're effectively making transactions with addresses, right? So in most cases that means you don't have to reveal your identity, although they might be able to track you back to a particular time and place. It's much more costly to do so, and so it provides a form of anonymity. Anonymity, by the way, that's pretty similar to cash transactions, right? Cash transactions aren't traced, and so when you see busts with cash, it's usually because someone in the mix knew that something nefarious was going on and reported the authorities. And so there's some similarities there between cash and Bitcoin. No chargebacks. So companies certainly love the no chargebacks, the sellers. This is one of the big reasons Overstock, well, one of the big reasons, but perhaps not the biggest, reasons that Overstock started accepting Bitcoin. You know, with traditional credit cards, you can go have a night out with your friends and wake up the next morning with a headache, calling your credit card company and saying things like, surf and turf, I didn't order the surf and turf. Manicure, pedicure, that wasn't me. And the credit card will reverse those transactions. That's not great if you're the seller, right? Because you've already delivered the goods at that point. And now the buyer is no longer following through with the payment. And so with Bitcoin, since we have this complicated cryptography problem, the the only way that you could get your money back from the seller is if the seller consented to that, right? Because that's the only way we would be able to hash this block and update the blockchain to reflect this new transaction, which would be from the seller back to the buyer. And so sellers really like this no chargebacks. Now there's something to point out about this. So that if most of you probably don't have this experience, you go onto Amazon and make a payment and it's no questions asked. But if you were in some other country, you would have a difficult time making purchases online. And the big reason is because they don't have access to any sort of credit verification. And when you use an American credit card, Amazon can be confident that this credit card company has some information on you and can get payment from you. If you're, in some other country, you might not have that option. And so the way these big online sales companies deal with this is just by not allowing those folks to make transactions on their sites. And so if the option is no transaction or a transaction where there are no chargebacks, as a buyer, you might like this no chargebacks thing as well. Now, certainly in the early stages, and you'll still hear some talk about this today, one of the big things that people talk about with Bitcoin is its predictable supply. So we've talked about how these blocks are hashed. All of the nodes on the system are competing to be the first one to process your transaction. Out of the goodness of their heart? Probably not. Right? So where's the incentive? Where's the reward for doing this? Well, the way that it works is that if you are the first person to process the transactions, you're actually awarded a balance of Bitcoin that's never existed again, never existed before. And so this is how new money enters the system. And so the way the reward structure works is that in the early stages, if you were the first person to hash a block, you would get 50 Bitcoins. Now I believe it's down to 25. And that reward keeps falling. And so by the year 2141, the reward will actually fall to 0. And so there will be no internal reward for hashing this block. And so the system at that point will just rely on transaction fees. But it actually it gets pretty close to 0 a long time before that. And so we can see the red line here gives you the projected supply of Bitcoin. And the blue line tells you the actual supply of Bitcoin. And you can see they're pretty close. They're really close. Now, how do we get this projected line? It's relatively straightforward. We know what the reward structure is. And the Bitcoin system has been designed in a pretty interesting way. So about every 2 weeks, they check to see how many blocks have been processed. Now, ideally, they're planning on a block of transactions to be confirmed about every 10 minutes. If it turns out that the computers on the system are solving this difficult cryptography problem more quickly than that, well, the algorithm just adjusts to make the problem more difficult. And so in doing so, in making the problem harder or easier, they're able to regulate the supply of Bitcoin. And we don't need anyone to manage this either, right? It's just part of the protocol to regulate this, the difficulty of hashing the block, and therefore regulating the supply of Bitcoin. So this is perhaps a desirable feature, right? A lot of folks have been worried about, say, quantitative easing and the Federal Reserve in the U.S. Printing up a bunch of dollars. They don't actually print them up. They're electronic entries. But they have significantly expanded the supply of base money. And Professor Kachanowski is from Argentina. They're dealing with some pretty significant inflation at the moment. And so if these are things that you might be concerned with, then having a monetary system where the supply is determined in a very predictable and known way might be a desirable feature. In fact, the economist Milton Friedman, he spent a long time in his career trying to persuade the Federal Reserve System to follow a rule, and at some point I believe he just got frustrated and didn't think that they were ever going to follow a rule, and so he changed his advice and advised that they put monetary policy on a computer. Just let a computer determine the growth rate of money. That's effectively what Bitcoin is doing here. I should say the supply of Bitcoin is stable, but as we'll see, that doesn't necessarily mean the value of Bitcoin is stable. Okay, so now we have a background here in Bitcoin, and we can ask the big question, will Bitcoin survive? Turns out it's a difficult question to answer. And so I'll give you my answer, but what I want to do is just go through the major issues so that you are able to answer this question for yourself. I think that reasonable people can disagree on the conclusion, but I don't think that reasonable people can disagree about the issues. And so what are the issues? Well, for one, Bitcoin faces an entrenched incumbent. So in America, that's the US dollar. As a show of hands, how many of you are currently using dollars? Yeah, exactly, all of us, right? And we're all using dollars, and so all of us are a bit reluctant to use anything else for a couple reasons. So for one, to switch currencies, we're going to have to incur some costs. We're going to have to incur some costs as individuals, right? Maybe if we were going to say switch to Bitcoin, we're going to have to start thinking about transactions in Bitcoin. Right? Or we're always going to have to remember to bring our phone around instead of our wallet. Right? These are relatively small costs, but they're costs nonetheless. And what about our infrastructure like ATMs and merchant payment systems? Right? So we have to make sure that those are perhaps retrofitted to accept whatever cryptocurrency we're using, so perhaps Bitcoin. And so we're going to have to incur some costs. So it's not enough, we've given some reasons for why there are some advantages to Bitcoin, but it's not enough that it just be better than the status quo. It has to be, one, so much better than the status quo that it warrants incurring these switching costs. Now, I actually think that the switching costs are relatively small. A lot of the infrastructure that we have in place, we could make payments with Bitcoin. How many of you are currently carrying a smartphone? So you've brought your Bitcoin wallet with you, even though you don't even have any Bitcoin. Right? And so I think that a lot of these switching costs are relatively small. The bigger thing in my mind is what economists call network effects. You see, the interesting thing about currencies, you want to use the same currency that your trading partners are using. Right? You don't want to show up at a store with dollars and they say, sorry, we only take euros here, because you're not going to be able to make those transactions. Right? So in this sense, money is a lot like a cell phone, or what other network goods can we think of? The traditional example was fax machines, but I don't even think, I've never used a fax machine, so I don't expect any of you to. But a telephone isn't that useful if you're the only one who has one. It's not that useful if other people have them, but you don't particularly like those people, because you wouldn't be calling them anyway. Right? So you're concerned with what currency, in the case of currencies, your trading partners are using. Now that means if you're going to start using something else, you want to make sure that they're going to start using something else as well, and so there's this problem of who's going to take the first step. So as an analogy, you might imagine a similar question of whether or not to drive on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of the road. So at present, we're driving on the right-hand side of the road. You might imagine that a new scientific discovery, a new scientific paper comes out that says conclusively that driving on the left-hand side of the road is safer than driving on the right-hand side of the road. How many of you just start driving on the left-hand side of the road tomorrow? And it would be helpful if everyone else is going to drive on the left-hand side of the road as well. Otherwise, it's not going to be safer at all. It's going to be a big mess. And so it's a similar question here with currencies. You want to use the same currency everyone else is using. There's this network effect. The value of the currency in terms of using it as a medium of exchange depends on the size of the network, how many people are actually using it. And the last factor here under entrenched incumbent is that it's subject to government regulation. Like any industry, it could be regulated out of existence. And we don't really know what's going to happen with government regulation. In the U.S., the U.S. government has said that that Bitcoin exchanges need to register as financial intermediaries, and so that seems like a tacit endorsement, but it's difficult to say what's going to happen next. After Mt. Gox shut down about I guess about a week and a half ago, Senator Joe Manchin made a statement that was basically said that the instability of Bitcoin required regulation. And so that suggests that there might be some serious regulation that will limit the success of Bitcoin. If you look around the world, it seems that a lot of countries are reluctant to give up their access to the printing press, to creating money. And so if everyone were using Bitcoin, they wouldn't have that access again. And so there are reasons that other countries might want to regulate Bitcoin extensively as well. And so we have these three negatives, you might think, three reasons why Bitcoin might not survive. On the upside, Bitcoin does have a bit of a first mover advantage. Right? It has a first mover advantage because it was the first real cryptocurrency on the scene. If you've heard about odds are that you've heard about Bitcoin, but even if you have heard about Bitcoin, it's unlikely that you've heard about many other cryptocurrencies. Occasionally they're talked about in the news, and we'll talk about some in a moment. But most people know Bitcoin and don't know any of the alternatives, and so that would be an advantage for Bitcoin. And one of the big things, so we'll go back to Overstock, this decentralized payment processing system allows you to process transactions very cheaply. And so Overstock is a relatively low margin business, and they, like a lot of businesses, really get hammered by credit card companies on transaction fees. It really cuts into their bottom line. With Coinbase, for example, you can make a transaction in Bitcoin and it has a 1% fee. 1% is pretty low. And so it's not so surprising when Overstock announces that it's made $1 million in transactions on Bitcoin, and that it averages somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 worth of Bitcoin transactions a day. And it's not surprising why they would want to encourage that, because every transaction that takes place in Bitcoin, they pay a smaller fee on. And so that means they're going to be able to keep a bit more of that profit. So Bitcoin definitely has this first mover advantage. It's the one you've all heard of. But there is some competition. Let's talk about the competition. Here's the thing with pretty much any digital program. Once you have it, it's very easy to copy. And so what a lot of people have done is taken this Bitcoin code, right? It's open source, and they've modified it. They've made some adjustments, and they've produced some alternative cryptocurrency, some altcoin. And so once, we said that solving this double spending problem, it was a big problem. A problem that a lot of smart people spent a lot of time trying to figure out. And when they finally solved it, now it's relatively simple for anyone to just create an altcoin. Right? And so that's what we've seen. We see tons of altcoins. I didn't even consider putting all the altcoins up here. This is just a small sampling. And so we've asked, will Bitcoin survive? I'm a bit skeptical, of course, as I've mentioned. But you might also ask, what about these alternative cryptocurrencies? Perhaps one of them will come to gain widespread acceptance. And we can think about the problems that they face. They also face an entrenched incumbent. It's the same entrenched incumbent that Bitcoin faces. And they lack the first mover advantage. Bitcoin already has that place. But what these altcoins have, we might call it a second mover advantage. So they can look at what worked reasonably well or what worked not so well with Bitcoin, and they can modify that to have a superior alternative. So we'll just give you a couple examples of those. So Litecoin, for example, is a bit different in a couple ways. One, the final supply of Litecoin is much larger than the final supply of Bitcoin, and so some people find that desirable. I think it goes, Bitcoin, excuse me, you can make transactions out to 8 decimal places, but with Litecoin, if it has a bigger money supply, you don't have to worry so much about those 8 decimal places becoming a binding constraint. Litecoin also processes your transactions in around 2.5 minutes as opposed to Bitcoin's 10. That's a pro and a con. The pro is that if transactions are processed more quickly, that reduces the amount of time where double spending could take place. On the downside, it means that that public record of all past transactions is going to have more blocks, because blocks are created every 2.5 minutes instead of every 10 minutes. And so that blockchain is going to be bigger than the blockchain associated with Bitcoin. And at least some people in the cryptocurrency system are storing that blockchain. And so that means the storage costs with Litecoin might be higher. Dogecoin, named after the popular internet meme Doge. Some people pronounce that doggy, but Wikipedia tells me it's pronounced Doge, so I'm going to go with that. This has kind of emerged as a way of tipping on the internet. And so instead of giving someone a like or a thumbs up or an upvote, you just send them some Dogecoin. Good job. And so that's kind of an interesting altcoin. Maza coin, earlier you'll remember that I put an asterisk when I said that no governments were involved with Bitcoin. Although that's largely true with Bitcoin, Maza coin is the first cryptocurrency, to my knowledge, that has sovereign backing. Now I probably should say quasi-sovereign backing. So I'm not sure if it's been confirmed yet, but it's vying to be the official currency of the Lakota Nation, a semi-autonomous North American Indian reservation in South Dakota. And so this is perhaps the first government-backed cryptocurrency. And finally, I'll mention Feathercoin. And I'll mention Feathercoin because I gave this, this talk about a week ago, and I was flying through LaGuardia, and as I sat down at the airport bar in LaGuardia, they had these fancy iPads that you could order on, and after you order, you could read the news. And so I was sitting there, and I happened to glance to my left, and I saw that the lady to my left was reading an article on the Mt. Gox collapse. I went, oh, that's kind of interesting. And she must have noticed that I noticed, because she says, do you know anything about this Bitcoin thing? And I said, yeah, I know a little bit about it. And we talked for a bit, and at some point she says, I am mining Feathercoin in my house as we speak. And I thought that that was the weirdest thing that anyone has ever told me in a bar, so I wanted to include a slide on that. Okay, so we have a bit of time left, I think. Yeah, a couple minutes. So I want to leave plenty of time for questioning. What's the word on Bitcoin? What's going on with Bitcoin? And so I've listened to the major stories over the last couple months. The first big story is the purchasing power volatility. And so here, if you look from January 2013 to March 2014, you can see that the closing price of Bitcoin has fluctuated a lot. Now, how can that be? We've said that the supply of Bitcoin is predetermined. Everyone knows what the supply is going to be. Occasionally, I'll get a call from a reporter and they'll ask me about the volatility of Bitcoin. And I'm always very confident when I tell them it's definitely a demand side issue. Because the supply is fixed. It cannot be a supply side issue. And so the volatility that we're seeing with Bitcoin is because of changes in the demand for Bitcoin. Now that might be because perhaps there's a change in the regulatory environment or the expectation around the regulatory environment. It might be because a popular exchange collapses. If you look, when Bitcoin really first started taking off here in the spring of 2013, if you ask yourself what was going on in the world around that time, well, there was a big announcement that some banks in Cyprus were going to be bailed out. And what we see that happened that weekend were lots of folks in Spain, so not even in Cyprus, but still in the Eurozone. A lot of folks in Spain started downloading Bitcoin apps. Right? So why did they do that? Well, perhaps one explanation is that for the first time they thought, wow, I'm not really sure that I want to hold my wealth in the Euro banking system. And so they are looking for alternatives. And what alternative was out there at the time? Well, one alternative was Bitcoin. And so we see that it started to take off there. There have also been a lot of announcements that we'll talk about in a second. Bitcoin has been banned in China. Now that's only partially true. What's actually true is that China banned its state-owned banks from processing transactions from dealing with Bitcoin. So presumably that doesn't extend to individuals who still might transact with Bitcoins. In France, it wasn't banned, but it was discouraged. And so when you're thinking about how that's going to affect the purchasing power, you have to ask yourself, what were they expecting in advance? So perhaps all of the folks in France were originally expecting that it was going to be banned, and then it comes out that it's just discouraged, and so then that would actually be good news for Bitcoin. And so it's kind of difficult to know what to expect when you hear news about this. We've talked about overstock quite a bit. 1 million in sales, $20,000 to $30,000 in sales in Bitcoins every day. And the reason that they're doing that is because the fees associated with making transactions in Bitcoin are so low. The Mt. Gox shutdown. Mt. Gox, when I started, I mentioned that you could, in 2011, you could buy 1 Bitcoin on the Mt. Gox exchange for $3.40. And by now, hopefully you realize that everything about that sentence sounds ridiculous now. Not only is a Bitcoin worth around $650 today, but you can't make that exchange on Mt. Gox because it's shut down. It's shut down abruptly, unexpectedly, and some people have seem to have lost their Bitcoin in the process. And so this was a big event in the Bitcoin community. The price of Bitcoin fell from, I believe, around $900 to around $650 where it is now. It actually fell a bit lower than that and recovered. And so this was a big deal. It definitely shook the confidence of a lot of people who were using Bitcoin. Perhaps it wasn't as secure as they thought it was. I actually see this as a positive for Bitcoin. You should note that Mt. Gox, that's not a place. It actually stands for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. Take that in for a moment. That's right. This popular, previously a Bitcoin exchange, had once been a place where you could trade cards, Magic the Gathering cards, on the internet. And so it was repurposed as this online exchange. I know what you're thinking. Mt. Gox used to be a place where you could go and trade fad items with questionable value. And now, it used to be a place where you could go and trade fad items with questionable value. It's just that those items were very different. So I actually think this is a good thing for the Bitcoin community. It actually cuts against my skepticism. Because now, instead of going to this Mt. Gox, which was, not all, it was professional, but not as professional as the alternatives today, like Coinbase and BitPay. These companies look a lot more like reputable businesses. They have big financial backing. They have very sophisticated websites with high security, and they seem interested in doing this right. Whereas Mt. Gox, right, Magic the Gathering Online Exchange, that sounds like something that some nerdy guy cooks up in his mom's basement. And so I think that this is actually a good move for Bitcoin. The news this week concerns a guy named Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto. Satoshi Nakamoto was actually the creator of Bitcoin. The thing is that no one really knows who he is. And so this week there were a lot of stories that perhaps they found him. They figured out that it was this guy named Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto. And perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. For our purposes, that's not all that important. The interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's decentralized. As long as no individual, Nakamoto or anyone, has control of a majority of the computing power on the system, they can't confirm their own transactions. Right? Or at least they can't expect to confirm their own transactions. And so that's kind of a desirable feature. It makes for a robust system in some respects. Okay, so what's the bottom line? Moving forward, what's going to happen with Bitcoin? Well, it's hard to say for sure. Personally, I'm skeptical that it's going to survive. Skeptical for a variety of reasons. Although I think the switching costs are low, I think that network effects are pretty large. If you look around the world at places that have spontaneously switched to an alternative currency, they tend to be hyperinflation examples. And at least in the US, very, very few people, you might even call them crazies, expect hyperinflation anytime soon. And so that would seem to cut against spontaneously switching to Bitcoin. The other time that people adopt a new currency is when it has some government backing. And so recent examples, we have the South Sudanese pound and the Somaliland shilling. The euro isn't that old, right? Just a decade, around a decade and a half with the euro. How did these currencies, how did they switch from the currencies they were using before to these currencies? Well, some government announces that they will accept the old currency for the new currency at a fixed exchange, and they credibly commit to do that, and they do. And so that anchors expectations, right? That's kind of like the government saying, next week we're going to say close all the roads on Sunday, and on Monday we're all going to drive on the left-hand side. So if you had some big focal salient event like that, then perhaps you could get switching. There's also an argument that cuts against this network effects, though, because there are some financial intermediaries like BitPay and Coinbase that allow sellers to receive, to accept payment in Bitcoin without actually receiving the Bitcoin. And so it works much the same way as if you take your American credit card to Europe. So you go into a German sausage shop and swipe. You're paying in dollars, but your bank is exchanging dollars for euros and paying the seller in euros. And so the seller is effectively able to accept payment in dollars without receiving payment in dollars. And so if you no longer have to be concerned with whether or not sellers are going to accept a particular currency, you can use pretty much any currency that you would like. And so that cuts against the network effects argument. But I'm still skeptical. I'm skeptical, and I recognize that reasonable people can disagree. Perhaps you will. And I'll just say, remember that story I told from the outset with my good friend Chuck and his high hopes for Bitcoin. I was wrong. I was dead wrong then. Boy, do I wish I had followed Chuck's advice and gotten in on the ground floor there at $3.40. I would happily sell them to all of you today at $650. So I was wrong then, and I might be wrong now, but I don't think so. So we'll have to wait and see. I look forward to your questions.
Intermediaries are there? Like, I would imagine that it's like PayPal. How many other companies do that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of startups that are trying to get in on this. The big ones are Coinbase and BitPay. I mentioned BitInstant as well. I believe BitInstant was actually backed by the Winklevoss twins for a while. Do you know these guys? Did you see, what was it, The Social Network? Was that the movie? They're the guys in Larry Summers' office complaining because Zuckerberg presumably ripped them off. Yeah, so they were backers of BitInstant, I believe. And so those are the big companies, but there are lots of smaller companies that are trying to get in on this. Effectively, you're just acting like some sort of a bank really, or a payment processor. And so if you're willing to hold some Bitcoin and presumably the alternative currency that you're swapping in and out of, you could start up one of these companies. So I think it's still too early to tell how many of these companies are going to survive or if any of them, but there certainly are a lot of them out there.
Can you talk about the trading volume on the Mt. Gox exchange? How large was that, and how did that affect the decline in value of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I don't have the trading volume for the Mt. Gox exchange on hand at the moment, but I can tell you that for say Visa, Visa processes, let's see, what's the stat? It's like 200,000 transactions a minute. Whereas Bitcoin, there were around 30 transactions a minute. And so that's around, so those figures come from around December of 2013. And so that transaction volume might be a bit larger today. The other thing that that you might be interested to hear is that the size of Bitcoin transactions tends to be a bit higher. So I think if I remember correctly, in December, the average Bitcoin transaction was around $2,000. I don't know how many of you have made a $2,000 transaction this week, but I don't think that I have. So hopefully that'll give you some perspective of the network size. The volume of transaction on Mt. Gox at the moment is 0. I couldn't be more confident about that.
So are Bitcoins just like more susceptible to be stolen, or is it that we like hear about these things more than? I mean, what's the volume of like Bitcoin stolen to like Bitcoins in existence versus like dollars stolen a day to dollars in existence?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. So I don't think that there's a fundamental difference in the two risks here, right? Just not too long ago, the Target was telling us all that we might want to change our credit cards if we've shopped at Target recently. And so the problem with fraud with Bitcoin isn't so much with the Bitcoin itself, but it's where you're storing these Bitcoins, in your e-wallet or on your hard drive. That, I think, is where it's susceptible to theft. And so, traditional banks face this same problem. Now, you might think that traditional banks are perhaps a bit more prepared to deal with those threats because they're bigger, they have more resources to throw at the problem, and that might be the case. But I don't think that there's a fundamental difference in security between our electronic payment systems with dollars and our electronic payment system with Bitcoin.
Did you buy any Bitcoin for yourself?
It's a good question. My friend Eli Dorado sent me some Bitcoin, but I haven't purchased any for myself. When I was a graduate student, I mentioned that my colleague had presented this paper on Bitcoin. But none of us were convinced. And so when another of my colleagues graduated, earned his PhD at the end of that year, he bought our advisor some Bitcoin as a gag gift. And I bought our advisor a traveling tie carrier. At the time, I thought the tie carrier was a better gift, but that tie carrier is definitely not worth $650 today. Yeah, back here in the back.
Yeah, sorry. Do you think that like the deflationary supply of Bitcoins has anything to do with like the volatility? And like, it seems like the volatility will be like a huge kind of barrier to people adopting it for like everyday uses, because your paycheck could be worth between like no money and a lot of money, and it would be better just to know how much money you have. And like, does that have anything to do with the fact that the supply is deflationary? And then like, otherwise, is there a way of controlling that level of volatility like while maintaining a decentralized structure?
So I'm not sure if I would describe the supply as deflationary. It does become constant, and so if there's productivity growth, that suggests that prices will fall, and so then we would experience some deflation. But in that case, we have to keep in mind a distinction between good deflation and bad deflation. And so a lot of economists have been concerned with deflationary pressures because in the Great Depression, the money supply contracted by about 1/3, and that that contraction, caused the Great Depression to be much deeper and longer than it perhaps otherwise would have been. And so that's a legitimate concern, I think. But that's very different from the kind of deflation we see when we're just having some gradual technological progress. When computers become cheaper to produce, their prices fall. And so as we get better at producing more of everything with less inputs, it's not so crazy to think that the prices of goods in general this period should be lower than the prices of goods in general last period. And in fact, there's good reason to believe that if your monetary authority tries to offset that by increasing the money supply, then you can actually generate some asset booms and do a lot more harm than good. So I don't think that the constant supply is leading to the volatility. I think that it's just that the Bitcoin network is relatively small, and so any change in demand is a big change in demand. So you can think about dropping a rock into the ocean versus dropping a rock into a small bucket of water. It's going to have a lot more volatility in the bucket of water, whereas when demand for something like the US dollar changes by the same amount, we don't even notice it because people all around the world are using dollars, lots of them. And so it's a very big network, whereas Bitcoin is still a really small network.
That is unknown. They're the ones who determine what the supply was going to be, and then what a year that the supply will run out. So that seems a little bit strange to me, and that no one really knows who created it. How did they do that?
Well, I mean, they just released, they actually, so I want to get my facts straight here. I'm not sure that I have them straight. There was a paper released in 2008 explaining how all of this would work. And then there was a open source software that was released in 2009. A guy named Gavin Anderson actually was kind of put in charge of kind of overseeing this steering committee for Bitcoin. And so he has had some contact with the original guy, but he hasn't revealed who he is. In some ways, a lot of people kind of gravitate to the mystery of this story. Some, anonymous guy creates an anonymous or quasi-anonymous currency, makes for an interesting headline. But I don't think that there's really anything to worry about there. I'm not really sure how that power could be abused because the system is designed in such a way that it's decentralized. And so even the initial creator doesn't have that power. And so in some sense, I think that having an anonymous origin kind of validates what Bitcoin is, right? It's that no one is in charge and that this currency is a self-regulating system and that you can process payments in a decentralized way, relying on the network.
Yeah. So, but how did he determine? I mean, was the supply number random, and the year that he decided it would run out random?
Well, it wasn't random, and it's decreasing at a particular rate, and so it certainly wasn't random. I don't know how much thought was paid to precisely how many Bitcoin would be in existence. But one of the reasons why it goes to 8 decimal places, right? With dollars, we usually only transact to 3 decimal places, and that's for purchases like gas, right? 350.9. But with Bitcoin, you can go to 8 decimal places, and the reason for that is that, well, if one Bitcoin is $1,000, you're not going to be using a Bitcoin to make a lot of transactions. You're going to be using fractions of a Bitcoin. And so if you have 8 decimal places, that allows you to make change quite a bit.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.